Hello, and welcome to Lesson 7. Today we're going to be talking about negatives as opposites. So let's get started. So essentially, we are continuing our conversation on addition, algebraic addition, but we're taking it one step further today. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on negatives and how we can perceive them. So let's think about what a negative is. If I have the number negative 3, for example, it's a terrible 3. 3. And I asked you, well, what exactly does that mean? A negative 3. Well, one way to think about negatives is to think of them as opposites of their positive counterparts. So, for example, if I take a number line, we'll throw that in here, and if I plot or kind of diagram where this negative 3 is going to be, let's say we start at 0, right? Start at 0. And if I'm trying to plot a negative 3, well, actually, you know what? Let's plot a 3 instead, not a negative 3. Let's plot a 3. So if I'm going to plot a 3, I would start at my number line 0, and I would draw all the way over to the 3, right? There's my 3. That's how far 3 takes me to the right of the number line. Now, if I were to ask you what's the opposite of 3, well, what that means is we would start at 0 again, only now we would go in the opposite direction, the same number of units. So if this is positive 3, the opposite would mean we go in the opposite direction, the same number of units, and we wind up getting a negative 3. So negative 3 is the same distance away from 0 as positive 3, but it is going in the opposite direction. So that's why when I ask what's the opposite of a positive 3, a very logical answer would be a negative 3. A negative 3 is the opposite of a positive 3. On the other hand, what's the opposite of a negative 3? Well, it's a positive 3. All right, and we could do this with any number and negatives. All right, so the moral of the story here is to think of the negative sign as an opposite sign. So if you see a negative 4, one way to think of this is the opposite. Just read opposite. Where you see the word, the sign negative, just put in the opposite of. So this could be read as the opposite of a 4. The opposite of a 4. Okay? Now, the reason this can be handy is because when we get to more complex expressions that sometimes involve more than one negative sign in a row, we can simplify them quickly without having to think too much. So, for example, if I have a negative 2, all right, what does this really mean? How could I simplify this? Well, it means the opposite. Remember, the negative sign means opposite. So the opposite of the opposite of a positive 2. The opposite of the opposite of a positive 2. So a way to kind of simplify this is to take this innermost negative sign right here, right, and recognize that this is the opposite of a 2, which of course is negative 2, right? But now I'm taking the opposite of a negative 2. So what's the opposite of a negative 2? The opposite of a negative 2 is a positive 2. So this whole expression in red can be simplified down to this positive 2 in yellow, right? So essentially, if you see a bunch of negatives in a row, they just mean the opposite of something. So let's go even further. Let's say if I have a negative, negative 3. And let's give myself a little bit more room here. Okay, so what would this simplify out to? Well, again, we kind of go to the innermost number. Well, in this case, it's the only number, but the innermost sign maybe for that number, which is a negative 3. So we kind of start with a negative 3, right? That's kind of our beginning point. And if you're to think about the number line, it just means we start with 0 and we begin by going off to the negative 3. Okay? But then where do we go? We take the opposite of the negative 3. So this sign right here indicates that we're taking the opposite of a negative 3, and the opposite of a negative 3 is a positive 3. So this whole piece just equates to a positive 3. And I can bring these brackets back down Okay, and my negative sign back down. And now I can say, well, what does this mean? Well, we're saying the opposite of a positive 3. And the opposite of a positive 3 is a negative 3. So we wind up with a negative 3 as kind of the simplified version of this kind of complex expression at the top. All right? Simple. Easy, right? All right. All right, so let's take a look at this problem and try to simplify it. So here we have multiple numbers and we're adding them together. Now remember, in algebra, we're always doing addition. All right, so that works out well for us here because, in fact, that's what they're telling us we're doing. We're adding these two numbers together. All right, so let's go ahead and try to simplify this. So we have a negative 3. So what's the opposite of a negative 3? Positive 3, right? And then I have this plus sign, so we're just going to bring him right down, plus. And then I have a negative 4. Well, there's nothing I can do in there. There isn't like a negative 4 or something like that. So he remains a negative 4. Now notice I'm keeping him in parentheses. Why am I keeping him in parentheses and I didn't keep the 3 in parentheses? Well, the reason being is if I didn't keep it in parentheses, I would end up with a 3 plus, because I brought that plus sign down, a minus 4. And it's never a good idea to have two signs in a row right next to each other. All right? Whenever you have that, always just place the number in parentheses so that it's clear what sign is with the number. All right, so that's why I kept this in parentheses. Now let's take the next step. So we have a 3 plus a negative 4. So now we have to go back to our algebraic addition and think about what we're doing here. We're taking a positive 3. If you wanted to, you could throw the little positive sign here. A positive 3, and we're adding to that a negative 4. So it's a positive and a negative. They're opposite signs. And the 4 is the stronger number, so we're going to keep that sign. So we're going to end up with a negative, and because they're opposite numbers, we're going to find the difference between these two numbers. So take the smaller away from the larger. So 4 minus 3 is 1, and we end up with a negative 1, right? That's just review from previous lessons. All right, there we go. Let's try a couple more. Why don't you pause the video, try this one on your own, and then we'll do it together. All right, so let's see how you did. So here we have a couple of numbers that are being added together. Now in the book, they're going to tell you to kind of divide this up. So maybe I'll show you how they would tell you to do it. And then if you feel comfortable enough with it, I think you can skip that and just kind of do part of it in your head. So this is what the book would tell you to do. It would tell you to first recognize that there are 3 numbers that are being added here, the 2, the 4, and the 1 with their respective signs, right? And because we're in algebra, we're always going to think of this as algebraic addition. We're going to add these things together. So the first thing they do is kind of separate this expression into its individual numbers. So we have a negative, negative, negative 2. All of that is kind of the 2 with all of its attached signs, okay? So that's really one number right there, all right? And then we have, and that's this number right here, right? And then we have the negative 4. So we have the 4, the number 4 with its attached sign, which is negative. But remember, in algebra, we're always adding. So we're going to add this negative 4. Notice I put in this addition sign. There is no addition sign up here. I'm placing it here because instead of subtracting these two numbers, which you might be tempted to do because of the negative sign here, I'm actually thinking of it in terms of addition. I'm adding the negative 4, okay? And then finally, they'll say, okay, the last number in this problem is the negative 1, all right? And in this case, there is that addition sign there, so I don't need to add 1. So we're going to have a plus, and then I'm going to have this negative 1. All right, so essentially they've taken each number and they've kind of placed it within its own little bubble, and between those bubbles are the plus signs. Okay, and then from there they work out what's in each bubble and they eventually get to the same answer that we're going to get to. However, if you feel comfortable enough with addition at this point, algebraic addition, I'm fine with the idea of just doing this bubble portion essentially in your head. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I'm going to rewrite this problem so it's not quite so messy. We have a negative bracket, negative 2 bracket, minus 4 plus a negative 1. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is essentially do the sorting in my head, the algebraic addition in my head. I'm going to recognize that there's like this invisible little plus sign right here between this negative 4 and this other number. But I'm just going to do it in my head, all right? So we'll start by just taking the first number, which is a 2, and all of its respective signs, and just simplify it so that we can have an easier solution here. So we have an opposite of an opposite of a negative 2. So we have a negative 2. We're taking the opposite of that. That's going to turn it into a positive 2. And then we have the negative of that. So we have an opposite of that, which is going to turn it back into a negative 2. So it goes from negative to positive to negative. So we end up with negative 2. And now this is where I'm going to do it in my head. I know that this is plus a negative 4 because we're in algebra. But I'm just going to keep it as, the negative 4. And in my head, I'll just remember there's an invisible plus sign here. It's a negative 2 plus a negative 4. All right? And then we'll move on to the plus here, just bringing this one down, right? And then we have the negative 1. Well, there's nothing we can do with that. So again, I'm going to keep it in parentheses because I don't like two signs in a row. Okay? Now I can just do some algebraic addition. So I have a negative 2 plus a negative 4. The signs are the same, so things are going to stay the same in the solution. So negative, and then we add the numbers. That's going to give us a negative 6. That portion is done. Now we have a negative 6 plus a negative 1. Again, the signs are the same, so we add the numbers, and we keep the sign, so it's going to be a negative 7. That is my solution. All right? Very good. Let's go ahead and try one more here. So try this one on your own, and then we will do it together. All right, so let's see how you did. So we've got all kinds of negatives all over the place on this one. Let's work it out. So let's take the first number, which is a 4. It's a negative 4. We're taking the opposite of a negative 4, so the negative becomes a positive, and then the positive becomes a negative again. So we end up with a negative 4. I'm going to bring this minus sign down. Whoops. Minus sign down. And then I've got here, I've got a negative 2, but then it's taking the opposite, so it's going to be a positive 2. So I could even do one step further even. You know what? Let's do it one step further. Let's not bring that negative down. We'll just do the whole thing together. So we have a negative 2, turns it into a positive 2. This negative turns that positive 2 into another negative 2. So we end up with a negative 2. And again, I'm just mentally remembering that this is negative 4 plus negative 2. Okay, next one. We have a negative, negative 3. So this is going to turn this positive. There's a positive in here, right? This negative means the opposite of that positive 3. So that's going to give me a negative 3 in here. And then the negative turns this negative into a positive. So we end up with a positive 3. All right, and then if we add these together, we have negative 4 plus a negative 2 is a negative 6. Negative 6 plus a 3. I have a negative and maybe I'll write it down here just till we're really good at this. I have a negative 6 so far. Negative 6 plus a 3, right, is going to give me a negative 3, right? Do you see why? All right, very good. So there we go. That is my solution. Excellent. And this is really as tricky as they are going to get. We will talk more about this in future lessons. We'll discuss this a little bit in more detail. But essentially, if you can understand it as we've just described it here today as the negative being an opposite sign, it does make these calculations a lot easier. So have fun with the seat work today. It should be a pretty easy lesson, and we will continue with more on this in the future. Have a great day.